Hello, everybody, and thank you all so much for joining us today. My name is Jonah from Spotlight, and today we are going to be talking to Marc. Marc, how are you doing today?
I'm doing fantastic. And you?
I'm doing quite good. Super excited for this event. I know we're both musicians, so it's always fun to dive into music content. And it's also really exciting to already see everyone tuning in. Usually, now is when I say hop in the comments, let us know you're here. But y'all are doing a great job. Feel free to call out where you're tuning in from, something you're excited to learn, maybe how you know about Marc, how you learned from Discover. We love all of that. And if you're watching the replay as well, hop in the comments, let us know the same things. And if you have any questions throughout Marc's presentation, pop them in the comments. If we don't get to them right away, we're not ignoring you. We'll save them and we'll get to them in the Q&A after the presentation. And if life happens, you have to get up away from the computer, Marc is moving fast, anything like that, don't fret. All of this will be available as a replay. It'll be on the Spotlight YouTube channel, on the Spotlight event page, and also emailed to you along with the course offer, which we'll talk about a little later. And just to make sure everyone is in the right place, like I said, we are talking to Marc, and we are going to be talking about how to create a great chord progression. You're going to learn how to create great chord progressions for your music. Marc is going to teach you the techniques used by composers, songwriters, and performers like Franz Schubert, George Gershwin, Paul McCartney, Bill Evans, Andrew Lloyd Webber, and Lady Gaga. They all use these techniques, and super excited to dive in. Marc, it looks like everyone is here. We got folks from the Netherlands, from Germany, from the UK. I saw from Seattle, which is my hometown. Love seeing Seattle representing. But I don't want to take up any more time. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Marc, for anyone that doesn't know who you are. If you can introduce yourself quick, and then we can dive in.
All right. All right. So, welcome everyone. I see some familiar names in there. So, hello to everyone that has been following me a while, and hello to all the newcomers as well. So, my name is Marc Sabatella, and for the people who are new and don't know who I am, what I do, I am the founder and director of the Mastering MuseScore school and community. So the school on Teachable is where I have online courses to teach you how to use MuseScore and to teach you music theory and composition. MuseScore is free and open source music notation software that I am one of the developers of and kind of one of the unofficial chief ambassadors for. I talk about it incessantly. But I'm not going to talk about MuseScore so much today. I'll be talking about music. And I've been talking about music way longer than MuseScore has been a thing. I mean, literally, before there was a World Wide Web, early 90s, I published a document called the Jazz Improvisation Primer that some of you may have read, and it was just a document available for download. And then I, answer questions in forums and stuff. So I've been teaching online forever, but I also do in-person events, workshops, and I teach at a couple of universities. So that's me. I want to feed a couple of things in the chat for you to talk about. And Jonah, I would say at some point, if there's a moment when we hear people's answers here a little bit, I want you to think about what makes a chord progression great. If the title of this is how to create a great chord progression, what does that really mean anyhow? And well, what are some specific examples? I mean, if you think about, what are some of your favorite chord progression? What kind of chord progression would you want to write? What kind of songs, what kind of compositions have the chord progressions that you're interested in? I would love to hear about that in the chat. And I can monitor the chat over here. So periodically, if you see me turn off to the side, it's because I'm looking at that. I've got, some pieces that I've chosen that we're going to use as examples, and I'll talk about what I mean by great in a minute. What I want to start, though, is just to kind of set some expectations here. People have all sorts of different backgrounds coming into this. Ideally, if you are watching this, there's some things I hope you already are familiar with. And if not, bear with us, and then maybe you can go back, review those concepts, and come back and watch this presentation later. But I'm hoping that you already know your major and minor scales. So that major scale, and I don't mean being able to play, I just mean know what notes are in them. So E flat is this, right? I just want you to know, what notes are in your scales. I want you to build major chords and minor chords. And I want you familiar with the idea of Roman numerals, that within a key we can label the chords in that key using Roman numerals. In the key of C, we talk about the 1 chord, the chord that's built on scale degree 1, the 2 chord, the 3 chord, the 4 chord, and especially the 5 chord, and the 6 and the 7. Each of those chords has a number, and we usually use Roman numerals for those. And so ideally you're familiar with that language, and then I'm going to really talk about how to manipulate that language, which of those chords to use when. So yeah, what is it that I'm going to talk about? Well, I'm going to talk about those chords, those 7 chords, some, because to some extent you can use any of those chords anytime and it's fine, but there's some things you can do that will make it that much more effective, and I want to make sure that we're using our diatonic chords effectively. But I also want to make sure that we don't just use diatonic chords, because that's not going to be what's going to make our chord progression great to me. It's going to be introducing chords that come outside of the diatonic ones that introduce notes that aren't in the key. And in particular, today we're going to talk about secondary dominants, diminished approach chords, and borrowed chords. These are the 3 categories of chords that we're going to talk about. And it's a lot to talk about. I mean, this is kind of a semester of music theory that I'm going to whittle down into an hour here. But I'm just gonna plow forward and see how much of this I can actually show you and then let you work on your own. So I want to tell you what I think about when I think about what makes a chord progression great. Okay? So if there's any particularly interesting answers that are showing up in the chat, I'd love to hear about those. But I'm going to talk a little bit about mine. And so, Jonah, if you want to pop in at some point, feel free. At some level, a chord progression should be smooth. It should feel like, oh, this chord leads to that one nicely, and it feels good. That's a very subjective thing, right? These are all subjective. There should be an element of familiarity to it. A chord progression doesn't have to be like, oh my God, I've never heard anything like that before to be great. No, it should sound like other great chord progressions. That's how we relate to them. That's what makes them sound, oh good, it sounds like that other thing, and maybe we can't even place what it sounds like, but it feels familiar. That's good. On the other hand, we don't want it to be exactly like something else because, well, then it's not our great chord progression, it's someone else's. We want there to be some interesting twists here. Something that's, slightly unusual, that's just interesting, it's interesting, it's unusual and unexpected. And yeah, when I say unexpected, I use the phrase expected surprises. I'm a Star Trek fan, and I'm really excited that Star Trek Picard debuts or premieres second season today, and I probably plan to watch that first episode after this. And I already know some things about it. I know Picard's in it, of course. I know Q makes an appearance because that's been all over the social media and all, and I know there's time travel involved. That's about all I know. So there's going to be some surprises. There's going to be things that happen that I'm like, oh, wow, I didn't know that. And, there's going to be surprises. That's what makes it interesting. But one of those surprises is probably not Harry Potter showing up challenging Picard to a Quidditch match. That's probably not going to happen. And it would feel weird if that happened. I'd be like, why is that in there? No. Not that I have anything against Harry Potter, but I don't want Picard showing up in Harry Potter, and I don't want Harry Potter showing up in Picard. They're like different worlds. So I want my surprises to be within the realm of what I'm looking for. So we plan our surprises to be just surprising enough to be interesting, but not so surprising that it's like, what? So that's what the kind of thing that I'm looking for here. So I just am going to take a look at the chat, but Jonah, if you've got
Mark,
anything you want to highlight.
yeah, we got a couple good answers here. Top Fingers, love that name, was saying a good progression has lots of smoothness and often meets expectations. A great progression takes that and adds an occasional surprise that is still not too jarring. So very in line with what you're
My
saying.
gosh, did you write my slides?
I
Could I get you to? That's great.
And then Dmitri was saying emotion is key for a great chord progression. And I love that. I know that may be ethereal to apply to theory, but I appreciate it because it still has to make us feel something, right?
Yes, and these are the elements that make us feel. We want
Right.
familiarity to relate. We want interest. We want surprise. These are feelings, and that's what makes it. That's where the emotion comes from. It's from meeting and breaking these expectations.
Love it.
All right, so I'm going to go on and talk about kind of a general method that we're going to look at here. And the method we're going to look at, it's got kind of a trip metaphor that I'm going to use. I'm going to be thinking about building a chord progression like going on a trip. And what kind of trip we're going on? Well, there's different kinds of trips and different kinds of chord progressions, but maybe I'm talking about one where I'm visiting some places around my house. Like maybe there's some friends that came in from out of town and I just want to show them the sights. So we're going to go to this museum over here. We're going to go to this restaurant over here. We're going to go up in the mountains a little bit because I'm in Colorado. And we're going to spend time at home just hanging, right? So we're going to choose some destinations to visit. And then I'm going to take them on a drive to get there. And maybe I don't just take the most direct route. I take a scenic route to get there. Because sometimes that's as interesting as the destination itself. And then, of course, we need to come home, too. And again, maybe pick some scenic routes to get home. So this idea that we have a home, we have a series of different destinations that we're visiting, and then we're taking interesting routes along the way. That is my metaphor for what we're going to be doing here. And in order to make this possible, there's some ground rules we need to know. We need to know how to drive. We need to know, we need to have a map of where things are, or at least a mental map or an online map. So that's my metaphor, and I'm going to come back to it as we go along here. So, okay, so now we jump right into some real specifics about, well, what are some of these ground rules here? Well, in music, it's this that I talked about with these diatonic chords. We want to know that these are the chords that are going to be safe and comfortable to use a lot. And I originally played them as triads, but from my experience as a jazz musician, we typically play almost everything as a seventh chord. Now, you don't have to do that. You're welcome to use triads, too. But I at least wanted to show what they look like as seventh chords so that as I introduce seventh chords, we've seen them. So the 1 chord is a major seventh, 2 is minor seventh, 3 is minor seventh, 4 is major seventh, 5 is dominant seventh, 6 is minor seventh, 7 is this half diminished chord or minor 7 flat 5, two names for the same thing. And then 1 is major 7th again. As triads, 1, 4, and 5 are major. Everything else is minor except 7. That's the way I usually remember. 1, 4, and 5 are major. These are our primary triads, and we're going to come back to that term in a moment. So 1, 4, and 5, those are our primary triads. They're major. The rest are all minor except for 7, which is diminished. That's how they work in major keys. In minor keys, they work differently. If this was a 2-hour presentation, I'd be going deeper into minor keys. But as it is, I'm putting this up there to look at. And we're going to make use of this. We're going to come back and talk about minor keys briefly. But for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to be focusing on pieces in major keys. So we have our chords. Now we want to know something about how they get used. And this is where I said, yeah, to some extent, use any diatonic chord anytime, and it's fine. But there is this thing called the circle of fifths. And yeah, we usually learn the circle of fifths as a kind of a crutch for building key signatures, right? You learn C has no sharps, and then you go up a fifth to G, and that's got 1 sharp. and go up a fifth to D, and that's got 2 sharps, and go up a fifth to A, it's got 3, a fifth to E, it's got 4, etc. So you learn to build your key signatures based on the circle of fifths. Okay, fine. That's another nice thing the circle of fifths can do, but that's not what makes the circle of fifths important. What makes the circle of fifths important is how it affects chords. Chords love the circle of fifths. In particular, they love to go down the circle of fifths. So an E chord, like E minor 7, loves to go down to A minor 7, down a fifth. And then the A minor 7 loves to go down to D minor 7. And that loves to go down to G7. And that loves to go down to C. Now, I did it by literally going down a fifth, but that takes you pretty low on the keyboard, right? So instead of going down a fifth, sometimes we'll go up a fourth. Down a fifth, up a fourth. Same thing. Some people call this a circle of fourths then because of that up a fourth thing. But it's down a fifth. That's still a fifth, right? Down a fifth is a fifth, so I call it still the circle of fifths. That sequence, 3 to 6 to 2 to 5 to 1, hugely, hugely, hugely important in music. And when I say that, I do want to actually pop up an example. I'm going to have all sorts of examples that I'm going to use for different things, and I want to talk right now about George Gershwin's I Got Rhythm. And if we were to play this in the key of C, it goes something like this. Just those first chords. We have C chord, and the C chord is like the end of the chain, so it doesn't need to go anywhere. But where does it go next? It goes to A minor, that's fine. But then it's circle of fifths from there. A minor to D minor to G7, and then to C. It's all circle of fifths from 6 to 2 to 5 to 1. So this is a great example of something that follows the circle of fifths. And it does it in other places too, and there'll be other examples we'll see. But I just can't emphasize enough how powerful the circle of fifths is when it comes to understanding chord progressions. So that's kind of tells you how the chords like to move. But they don't just do that. There's other things that you can do with chords, and I want you to notice something about these chords. I didn't play E, A, D, G, C. I didn't jump around like that. E, A, D, G, C. I didn't jump. I connected things smoothly, right? So that everything stayed right here in this same octave here. Not that this is the magic octave, it is a good one. But by rearranging the notes, instead of playing A minor 7 here, I played A minor 7 here. It's the same 4 notes, A, C, E, and G. But I played them right where my hand already was. E minor 7, A minor 7. Now, I'm describing it on the piano, but the same applies on guitar, same applies for arranging for voices or arranging for horns or for strings or whatever. You want each of the 4 notes or however many notes you're writing to connect smoothly. So from the E minor 7 to the A minor 7, the top note went ba-dum, and this note went ba-dum. And this note went ba-dum, stayed there, and that note also stayed there. Everyone got to move smoothly. This is called voice leading, when you connect chords smoothly. And this is another thing that cannot be overstated. You could write the best chord progression in the world, and it will sound terrible if you don't connect them smoothly. Things should generally, like in my example here, going from G to C, B goes to C, D goes to E, G stays on G, and the other G goes up to C. So all those upper voices there got to move nice and smoothly by step. This is what we are looking for in music. And so I want to flip over to another example here. Oh, by the way, my examples are all in the key of C. And I'm doing this on purpose because it makes it really easy to then, well, first of all, it makes it really easy to see when chords are not diatonic, but it also enables us to see similarities between pieces. Hey, this chord, that song had D minor to G7 to C. This one also has D minor to G7 to C. That must be important. So this is a very famous Bach prelude. And goes on from there. Even though it's all the notes are kind of played one at a time, if you look at it one measure at a time, that's a C chord. That is just a C major triad stretched out and arpeggiated. The next chord is D minor 7. D, F, A, and C. And the notes have been scrambled a little bit, but they've been scrambled nicely. Because instead of, what it means is this E got to move to that F by step, and G got to move to A, C got to move to D, right? Everyone got to move. The E came down to D. Everyone got to move by step. And then from the D minor 7 to the G7, also everyone got to move nicely. F stayed F, and I won't sing that high too much, don't worry. D stays D, and A goes to G, and D stays D, and C goes to B. Each of the voices, and that's what we call them, the voices within that chord moved by step. That's what makes this piece. It's a beautiful chord progression also, but there's not a specific melody to it. It's all about the voice leading of every single voice. Now, you could add a melody on top of this, and of course that happened, right? There's an Ave Maria melody that was written on top of this by Schubert, I believe. Now I'm doubting, but someone in the chat can correct me if I'm wrong, that Schubert is the one who added the melody to that. Because there's also the Gounod, and I can't speak French at all. Anyhow, there's different Ave Maria melodies. But the voice leading is what makes this piece. Now, that voice leading, in that case, involved all the voices. But my version here has the upper voices connecting smoothly, but the bottom voice is leaping. Well, that's okay. Bottom voices can leap. The bass voice does typically leap because circle of fifths. It's going to leap down a fifth or up a fourth an awful lot. This is where the idea of inversions come from. Inversion basically means letting the bass have a note other than the root. You learn that inversion is this, just rearranging the notes on top, but that's not really what it's about. I could do that all day long, but as long as I have a G in the bass, that's root position. This is root position, this is root position, that's root position. As long as the root is in the bass, doesn't matter what's happening on top. So the upper voices, we're always going to want to have good voice leading. The bass voice will often just follow the circle of fifths, but sometimes we like it to also have fun voice leading, like here where I go from G to G7 with an F in the bass to C with an E in the bass, G, F, E. That is a nice little melody in the bass there. And it's still just 5 to 1. It's still just G to C, but it's using inversions to smooth out the bass line. And not only that, it also allows this C chord to feel not final. Right? If I play this, okay, song's over, let's go home. But maybe we don't want that. If you want to come home, like think about my trip metaphor, you're planning your trip and yeah, you're going to the museum and then maybe you just stop home just to go to the bathroom or something and then you head out to the restaurant. So coming home doesn't necessarily mean you're going to bed. It just might mean a little quick stop at home. So that's what inversions can do for you also. And so I want to show you another example here. And so again, about these examples, I put them all in C. That Bach prelude was in C originally, but some of these other ones I am rewriting in C, and I'm simplifying them to just a melody and chords, so that you can kind of not have to worry about all the orchestration, all the other stuff that's going on, so that you can kind of understand these harmonically. So here's the very famous Romeo and Juliet love theme from Tchaikovsky. So, inversions, right? G starts off with C with a G in the bass. Why? To feel a little, not like we're starting at home, but we're starting somewhere else. And then it uses that exact sequence that I just showed you. G7 with F in the bass, going to C with E in the bass, so that it doesn't feel like we're home yet. And then it does circle of fifths from there. This is 7 to 3, to 6, to 2, to 5, to 1. It's all circle of fifths starting on that 7 there. Now, these chords are not those ones that we talked about, right? That B is not half diminished, the E is not minor. That's because of something, secondary dominance that we will be talking about soon. So this, to me, is like a really nice example of the use of inversions to smooth out that bass line and to create a new texture so that I don't feel C. I feel C. A little like not C with a period at the end of that sentence, but C with a comma. So these are kind of these ground rules that I said kind of set the stage. But now we want to actually start planning our trip. Now we've learned some ways of getting around, but now let's plan the actual trip. So the thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to divide up our song into phrases, just like we're going to divide up our trip into going to the museum, coming home, go to the restaurant, go to the movies, come home. Right? So it's a series of places that we're going to. So we're going to identify these places we're going to. And this is musically phrases. And so if you think about like a song with lyrics, basically each line of lyric is essentially a phrase. Maybe it's 2 phrases if it's a longer line, or if it's a da-da-da-da-da-da with the last note being held out for 2 measures. Well, okay, in that case, then maybe it's 1 phrase up until the last word of the phrase, and then the last word of the phrase, the last word of that line, a lyric, might be a phrase in itself. It's subjective. It doesn't matter. Sometimes you can zoom in and say, hey, I want to look at each little piece of this along the way. Or you could zoom out and say, I'm going to look at that whole line of lyric as 1 phrase. You can look at it multiple ways. But what I want to do here is divide things up into phrases to be simple, to put in simple chords. And I'm mostly going to focus on primary chords at first. I want to focus on the 1, the 4, and the 5 to kind of define where this song is going. And if it's a song that I'm writing, maybe I hear different chords right away. But if it's one that I'm taking and I'm adapting, I want to think about what's the simplest version of this song, and then I will complexify it. So we'll talk about substitutions, and we'll talk about different routes we might take to reach our destinations. So I want to show you a fun happenstance example that worked out here, and this is, as I am told, an actual Ukrainian folk song by Beethoven. Well, not by Beethoven, that Beethoven arranged. And again, his version, was arranged for piano and a flute duet. The flute part was added later. I've reduced it down to just this lead sheet here, but the original version is not much more complicated than this. And it goes like this. That's basically the melody. There's another phrase also that we'll look at in a second. So that is our thing, and it's basically 2 phrases. And then another one that goes. His original harmonization has a chord every beat, a different chord every beat. Well, that's fine, but maybe what we want to do is just have a simpler version of it. So I've created my own simpler version here that's just took out the extra chords in there. Why did I take them out? Because I want to put my own chords in. So I want to have a simple phrase structure. I don't want to have to visit every chord that Beethoven visited. I want to get to the same museum that he's going to, but maybe I'm going to take my own path to get there. So this idea that I've divided this song up into these little 2-bar phrases, and it's nothing but 1, 4, and 5 chords. Beethoven had a couple extra chords in there, but mostly it was just 1, 4, and 5, and that's what I've done here also. So I say this is a Ukrainian folk song, and obviously we know what's going on in the world right now, and Ukrainian solidarity and unity and all is a great thing to be having right now. I don't know the name of this song. Beethoven didn't give it a name. He called it like folk song from Little Russia, and then the editor called it Ukrainian folk song. And as far as I know, it actually is a Ukrainian folk song. I would love it if someone in the chat was able to chime in and tell us what is this song actually called and what is its real story, or at least information I could look up. So that's this piece, and we're going to use this as an example. I'm going to actually build up my own harmonization for that over the next, half hour or so. So I've chosen these primary triads here, but also we want to be able to make substitutions because even our destinations don't have to just be 1, 4, and 5. So I live in the Denver area, and everyone who comes to Denver knows about a certain set of things. Actually, I don't even know what they might be, but the one that people talk about is Casa Bonita. It's a restaurant that was featured on a South Park episode, and it's sort of actually being sold to the South Park creators right now. And so maybe people had it in their mind they wanted to go there. Well, we don't have to go there. It was never famous for its food anyhow. So maybe we go to some other restaurant instead. But, we're still going to a restaurant, right? So, and sometimes it's about, well, let's not go to that place. That's the touristy place everyone goes to. Let's go to this more out-of-the-way place that's really good. So sometimes substitutions are nice for things like that. Substitutions in which you're like, well, instead of going to the 1 chord, I'm going to pick a different chord to come visit. I'm not going to go to 1, I'm going to go somewhere else. Or instead of using 4, I'm going to use something else. So there's a set of substitutions, again, still just within the world of diatonic chords that we could know. So 5 likes to go to 1, but 5 likes to go to 1, yes, but 5 also likes to go to 6. This is the so-called Deceptive Resolution. That's about as deceptive as the game of peekaboo. We all know it's coming. We all know it's a thing. At least you have if you've studied this at all. But it's still nice to have happen. It's one of these expected surprises. 5 can go to 6. In the jazz world, we often have 5 go to 3 instead, because then we can start a little 3, 6, 2, 5, and we like to do that. So 6 is like a substitute for 1. They all have that E in them. They all have that same note. They all have that scale degree 3 in them. And that's probably what makes them sound similar. They have that one really important note, scale degree 3, that helps define oneness. 4 also has a substitute. Instead of 4 to 5 to 1, we could use 2 to 5 to 1. And also, it's got scale degree 4 in it. The 4 chord has that note in it, but so does the 2 chord. So those chords can substitute for each other. And then the 5 chord also can have substitutes. Instead of 5 to 1, we can have 7, that diminished chord, going to 1. But another really powerful thing, especially in the jazz world, is to take that 4 chord and say, you know what, instead of a whole measure of that chord, let's split it up. Let's go 2, 5, 1. So taking a 5 chord and splitting it up into a 2-5, expanding it is a term that's sometimes used. So taking a 5 chord and expanding it into a 2-5. This is a really powerful technique that jazz musicians especially use because we love that 2 chord. It would be, I would do a whole other hour presentation on everything having to do with the 2 chord. So this is a lot just about diatonic chords here. And I do want to come back and show you something that Beethoven did in that same piece. The original theme much like the secondary theme there. You can see him using 1, 4, but then also using 2 in the middle of the measure. So he's like saying 4 and 2, yeah, they're kind of similar. I can let them share a measure, right? So he's taking advantage of that. But that's in the theme. In one of his variations, because this is a theme and variations, he actually rewrites the melody a little bit, but this is the same spot in the song. So instead of the 1 chord, he uses the 6 chord, right? And then at the end, instead of coming back to 1, he goes to 3. And he changes the melody too. Because in theme and variations, that's expected. You're going to change the melody. In a lot of what I do, I keep the original melody of a song, but I provide my own harmonies. So here you can see, just in the space of these 4 bars, Beethoven doing almost all those things. You see him using 2 as a kind of a substitute for 4, and you see him using both 6 and 3 as substitutes for 1. So that's a lot just out of diatonic chords. But the real interest comes when we start using non-diatonic chords. So that's what I want to spend the rest of this time talking about. And I said there's 3 things we're going to talk about: secondary dominants, diminished approach chords, and borrowed chords. So let's launch into this. So in my version of this Ukrainian folk song, I actually created my own version here that I showed you, in which it's just 1, 4, and 5. But then I made a little change to it where I just replaced those 4s with 2s. Instead of 4, 5, I made it be 2, 5. So I just made that change. And I didn't do it everywhere. Sometimes I used the D, sometimes I stayed with the F, just to have some variety. I also used an inversion here. Instead of 1 to 4, I decided, hey, let's have some variety. 1 in inversion. And then 2, 5. And now, instead of going back to 1 like the original did, let's go with 6. And then another C with an E in the bass, maybe. I don't know. I have 2 C in the E, 2 with C, 2 C with E in the basses in a row. I think this one, I don't want that way. I think I just want it to be a C, because I think that's what I'm going to do. I'm looking for variety, so I don't want to have 2 root position C chords in a row. Don't necessarily want to have 2 first inversions in a row. So calling an audible on that. Save. So I'm going to start building that up using these devices for adding chromaticism. Chromaticism meaning notes outside the key. So yes, we've talked about diatonic ways of getting there, moving along the circle of fifths, or just throwing in any old chord you want, and that idea of 6 substituting for 1. All that stuff is good. But the real action is when we start introducing what are called tonicizations. These are things that make these destinations feel important. Tonicization means to make tonic. Tonic is a word for the 1 chord. So if we're in the key of C, C is our 1 chord. But sometimes we're going to take some other chord and pretend it's the 1 chord. And we're going to pretend we're in that key and give it its own personal 5 chord. So what do I mean by that? Well, for instance, in the key of D, D minor, because we're in the key of C, our 2 chord is D minor. If I play a D minor scale, and then maybe I make it harmonic minor, right? Harmonic minor is called that because it's got nice harmonies. It has that nice C sharp. If I want to take a D minor chord and pretend I'm in the key of D minor, what would the 5 chord in D minor be? Well, it's A, or A7. So A7 to D minor. That would be 5 to 1. So that's what I have here. And I call it a secondary, not just me, everyone calls it that. A7 to D minor. You can also use the 7 chord in that way, because as I mentioned, the 7 substitutes for 5. So instead of A7 to D minor, we can have C sharp diminished. to D minor, or the way I actually wrote it there. So this idea that you can tonicize a minor chord by giving it its own personal 5 chord or its own personal 7 chord is huge. It is absolutely huge. So I want to flip over to a couple of my examples, and if you look at the Bach example, right where I stopped on the second line here, the next thing we see is still diatonic. Now, ooh, there's an F sharp. What is that doing there? It's because that D chord is tonicizing the G chord. If we were in the key of G, D would be the 5 chord. So that's creating the illusion of 5 to 1 in the key of G. And Bach does that again a couple measures later. 5 to 1 in the key of G. Now we're not really in the key of G, we're just visiting it, tonicizing it. Now he does that diminished thing. A C sharp diminished going to D minor. So he's now tonicizing D minor by giving D minor its own personal 7 chord, its own C sharp diminished chord. So we have that C sharp leading to the D minor. The D7 leads to the G, the C sharp diminished leads to the D minor. And there's another example that I can show you here. This is Chopin. Now, you see what I mean about recognizing things? There's that same C sharp diminished going to D minor. In this case, he keeps a D in the bass the whole time because that's a thing too. It's called pedal point. I talk about that more in my actual harmony course. So you can see Chopin doing the same thing of tonicizing that D minor by giving it a diminished chord. And then he does the next measure, E7, to tonicize the A minor. And then F sharp diminished to tonicize the G7 sus with a B in the melody, which is beautiful. He's got it. Sounds better in Chopin's voicings. But so we got to see several of these here. A7 and C sharp diminished, both kind of tonicizing that D minor. G, that's just our 5 chord, but then E7 is the 5 chord in the key of A minor. F sharp diminished is the 7 chord in the key of G. So that we are tonicizing these chords using the 5 chord and the 7 chord in that key. Now if you look at my handout, I mentioned something else, that although diminished chords coming up from a half step below, like 7 to 1, C sharp diminished to D minor, that's definitely a thing, been around a long time. But there's another thing that's also kind of nice, especially as a way of kind of approaching a 2 chord. And that's to approach it above, from D sharp diminished to D minor. D sharp to D minor. Some people would call that E flat diminished. But we're approaching the D minor with a half step from above. And that's been around for a long time also. Definitely composers have used that. They call it a passing diminished chord. But the example that I want to show you is, I'm going to show you 2 examples that are not nearly as old. First of all, in I Got Rhythm, which is, it's almost 100 years old at this point. The next thing that happens is D sharp diminished to G to D to G. So there's an example of George Gershwin using it in I Got Rhythm. And the thing with I Got Rhythm, if people aren't familiar with jazz, is I Got Rhythm is a crazily important song in jazz history, in which it became just an obsession of improvisers for decades to say, let's get really good at improvising on that chord progression. Let's write our own melodies on that chord progression. Let's come up with our own variations of that chord progression. But you get to see that diminished chord coming down. Here's an example from somewhat more recently. This is John Lennon, Paul McCartney. John Lennon is the primary author of this song. McCartney says that he helped on it, and I have a feeling I know where he did, and I'll talk about that later. But then, right, it's got that D sharp diminished going to D minor. So you get to see Lennon and McCartney using that same device. So that's ways that you can get to an interesting chord. If I want to get to that D minor chord, give it its own 5 chord, give it a 7 chord, approach it from a half step above with a diminished chord, which really only works to approach that 2 chord. But those other techniques you can use elsewhere, like here Lennon and McCartney use it to approach the 4 chord. There's the 4 chord at the bridge, and they approach it with C7. C7 is the 5 chord in the key of F, so that's where they're using a secondary dominant. So these are all ways of getting places. Secondary dominants and these diminished approach chords, either a half step below or a half step above. But the last thing that I want to show you is, well, we got to come home. And yes, we can come home with 5-1 or 2-5-1, but there's other ways of coming home that are interesting. So before I show you that, I am going to just quickly show you my exercise, my Ukrainian folk song, where originally I just had C and then 2-5. Well, in the next version of it, I give that D minor its own 5 chord. Right? I give that D minor an A7. And then in the next measure, the next phrase, I use the diminished trick. And then, right? So I use that, both of those techniques, giving them a secondary dominant and giving it that diminished approach from below. I also found a place to use a diminished approach from above. So I have a C chord, then that same D sharp diminished that we've seen, and you see now the benefits of me having put all of these in the same key. So I've got my D minor, that was kind of my target chord, and I approached it with that diminished a half step above. So again, the final real main thing that I want to talk about here is ways of coming home. And we've talked about, yes, diatonic, 2-5-1, circle of fifths will get you home. Tonicization is great. Yes, we can tonicize that 5 chord. So instead of just G to C, we can have dominant 2 to tonicize the 5, and then tonicize the C. And I can actually show you that happening in I Got Rhythm. The end of the bridge of this song is all secondary dominants. And then dominant 2. Then there's this funny chord to G. The funny chord it's a augmented 6th chord or tritone substitution. Again, an advanced technique I'll talk about in the harmony course, the full course. But if you ignore that chord, you see the D7 going to the G. D7 going to G. It's the dominant of G, the 5 chord in the key of G. So yeah, you can use those techniques that we've already seen to help you come home. But the final thing is this awesome technique called modal mixture. And in particular, the idea of what we call a borrowed chord. And so again, I need to temporarily think back to the fact that minor keys are a thing, and that the 4 chord, if I'm in C minor, the 4 chord is F minor. Oh, it's a beautiful chord. People who follow me know it's like my favorite chord in the world. So just like we could have 4 go to 1, that's a thing. It's called a plagal cadence, right? Amen. But we can have the fancier version, Amen, where we go 4 and then minor 4 to 1. That F minor chord doesn't belong in C major, but it's perfectly at home in C minor. And also the 2 chord in a minor key is a half diminished chord. Well, we can use that in a major key also. Half diminished 2 to 5 to 1. And the 7 chord in a minor key is a fully diminished chord. And we can use that in a major key also. And so again, if I flip and show you my examples, Other than the Bach, they all do this somewhere. Here's the Chopin Nocturne. Here's kind of the bridge there, starting in bar 9. A secondary dominant, then 4, minor 4 to 1. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. Romeo and Juliet. Half diminished 2 chord. Oh, lovely. And it's all about that A flat. That's the common denominator here, right? That's what made F minor minor. It's what makes D minor 7 flat 5 half diminished, and it's what makes the B fully diminished. That A flat, that's the key. Scale degree flat 6. Let's keep going. I got rhythm. I got rhythm's got one too. It does. I played the first 4 bars. Now here, 4, minor 4. Yeah? And even the Beatles can't help themselves. Going into the bridge. Then minor 4. Back to 1. The Beatles love that chord. Not almost all, but a whole ton of their songs from that period had that. And I think that's Paul McCartney's doing. I personally suspect Paul, who kind of knew the language of the jazz standard kind of repertoire, he probably introduced John Lennon to it. That's my theory. So, I do want to just play you my final then version of my song, in which I apply all of that to that Ukrainian folk song. And then sorry, I got turned around for a second there. And then the second phrase, I harmonized it as. Oh, sorry. I love that one. Every single one of those chords I stole from one of those other places, right? Every single one of those chords, that E7 going to A minor, that was in the Chopin. The F sharp going to G was in the Chopin. The D sharp diminished going into the D minor, that was in the Gershwin and the Paul McCartney, or the John Lennon, right? All of these chords are things that we've seen because of this common language that permeates jazz and classical music and pop music. And you can bring all of those elements of this language into your own music. So that's it in a giant nutshell, right? There's more. There's much more to understanding about harmony. But boy, there's an awful lot of music that you can create with basically just those elements. If you're feeling like you're, needing more help just on the basics of getting up to speed on triads and scales, I've got a basic music theory course. But if you are like enjoying what you're hearing here and are wanting, hey, let's get deeper into that. That went by kind of fast. Let's take that a little slower, and then let's go beyond it. That's what my harmony and chord progressions course is about. And I also have this weekly stream I do called the Music Masterclass on Thursdays, and we'll talk more about that going forward also. But that's something where I select music that people have submitted and give my feedback on it. It's a masterclass situation. So I've been talking and talking and talking, and hopefully this thing is still on, but every once in a while look over and see myself still on the other screen. So I'm hoping that we have some questions coming in and some discussion that we can make happen here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark. I love diving into these things because I think it's so easy when you're starting with music to think that the chords that are there are what you have to play. And it is so flexible.
Yes, and as a jazz musician, that's one of the things that I do a lot is reharmonization. But as a
Yeah.
composer, you're writing your own chord progressions, and it's the same language.
Right, right. Well, and so for everyone watching, please pop any questions you have in the comments. We have some more time here with Mark to answer those questions. And I also just wanted to note for the harmony course, the link is in the comments and in the description, and there's a discount on it for a week. So there's a little time to grab it. And I'm also posting right now the link to Mark's other classes. So, like he said, if you need a little more help on some of the basics and stuff like that, that's there. And not to keep ranting here, but below that is also the link to Mark's community as well. Before we dive into questions, I think it's so cool you built this community because a course is one thing, but to have regular accountability is so valuable. Does that come with your courses? What is it
Yes.
like? Like, can you talk a little about the community? Because I know
Let me
how
do that.
important that
Oh
is.
yeah.
Yeah.
So the community is something I started about a year ago. I always had comments in my courses, but gradually became aware that that it wasn't building community. It was allowing people to ask questions, but it wasn't allowing for the free interchange. So there's a community hosted on a platform called Circle, which is a great platform for this sort of thing, and it is free to join. If you join my school for free, you are automatically a member of the community also. And so you can participate in the discussions and so forth, including this music masterclass that I mentioned. That is just a weekly live stream that I do. But then I have other courses on my school. The harmony course, the basic theory course, a MuseScore course, a counterpoint course, all sorts of different courses to teach different subjects. And there's parts of the community, and those are all available for one-time purchase or subscription, different ways of doing it. And then the community has a section there that's just for the people who are in that class, or just for the people who are monthly subscribers to the what I call my all access membership.
Love it, love it. Well, and I just think that's so cool because just throwing people out on a course can be helpful, but having people to keep inspiring you and throwing stuff back and forth is so valuable, especially with music. Uh, we have some great questions coming in. You want to launch in and we can start going?
Yes. All
Yeah.
right. So I see
So
some. Yeah, you go.
yeah,
If
yeah,
you've
yeah.
already
I've been
curated for me.
Yeah, been trying to tag and save them. First, I thought this was a wonderful question. It will be brief, but Rob was asking, Mark, how are you?
I'm doing fine. Never better.
um, and then this was a great question that just came in, and I think is wonderful to cover right away. McCartney claims he can't read music. So how would he know how to go from the four to the minor four to the one? Do you have an opinion on that, or
Yeah,
yeah?
I do. Because it's a question that comes up pretty often. And to me, if you think about it right, it's not the least bit surprising. There's any number of people who can speak English but can't write it. Maybe it's not as common now as it was 100 years ago, but it's being able to speak a language and being able to write it are they don't necessarily go hand in hand.
Mhm.
So it's, if you just play the guitar and you can, someone showed you an F chord and someone showed you an F minor chord, even if you don't know what the notes are, you know what the shapes are on the guitar. And I don't know how to play a F minor chord, but whatever. You learn the chord shapes, and then you've played songs that have that F to F minor to C, and you're like, wow, that sounds really good. I'm going to write a song that does that same thing. So whether or not you're reading the dots and stems and ovals and all that, he certainly knows the names of these chords. He talks, any number of interviews, you can hear him talk about that, and he knows chords, even if it's not about ovals and sticks on a staff.
Right. So he may not be able to sight read a piece, but he
Yeah.
can at
Although
least
if it was chord
communicate.
symbols, he could probably sight read from the chord symbols as well as anyone, is my guess.
Right.
Both on
Right.
piano and guitar and bass, I would imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I love it. I wanted you to talk about this because I think there's so many levels to reading music, and people get scared what exactly that means right off the bat.
Yeah, and getting all those details of the voice leading right, I mean that requires maybe slowing down, and writing does help for that. But there's an awful lot that you can work out just based on knowing the names of the chords. And F goes to F minor and goes to C, and if you know what notes are in an F minor chord and you know what notes are a C chord, you can figure out, I don't want to do this. How would I rearrange that? I'll do this. You can do that at the piano. It's harder on the guitar because the guitar is not as visual. The piano is a great instrument for working out ideas, whether you read music or not.
Right. Love it. I thought this was another great question. Sora was asking, maybe for another class, but how do you work with these phrases when our music stretches for 2, 3, 5 minutes? So we worked on little chord progressions. How does that play into like composition for a whole song?
So, I mean, one aspect of the answer to that is it's just more of the same.
Right.
5 minutes is still comes 2 measures at a time. Every 2 measures, and another 2 measures, and another 2 measures, another 2 measures. So at some level, you still have that. But usually things organize themselves more. So like Sora, I'm familiar with some of your pieces from the music masterclass, and you tend to write in a different type of language, right? It's not this Western harmony language, but hearkening back to some modal techniques and other cultures and so forth. But it's still the case that we typically write in larger phrases that can then be divided up into smaller ones. So all of those songs that I talked about all had 8 measure phrases. I didn't go out of my way to point that out, but they all had an 8 measure phrase. And then you can zoom in on that, and there's a 4 measure phrase, and then zoom in on that, and there's a 2 measure phrase.
Right.
But there's still the 8 measure phrase, and then there was 32 measures. Like I Got Rhythm is 32 measures. A jazz musician will play for 15 minutes on I Got Rhythm by repeating those 32 measures over and over and over and over and over and over. So often repetition is a big part of that story. Or if it's like a classical sonata, you have your A theme, which might be 30, you have your original theme might be 16 measures, and it might really just be 8 measures repeated. Then you have your B theme, which is another 16 measures, and then you repeat the A theme, and then you repeat the B theme, and then you have your development section where you start playing with those ideas, but it's still built, out of these same building blocks.
Well, and I just want to call out, I love, because I was following along a little on my guitar and also thinking it's so fun if you find a progression you really like. The tools you're giving are a great way to mix it up, maybe just once here or there.
And I love that. As an improviser, it pains me to have to play the same chord progression twice in a row. So I typically don't. I typically vary it every single time I'm playing while I'm improvising. That's like the challenge I give myself.
Right, keep it spicy. I love it.
Yeah.
Okay, we got more questions here for Cruising, Mark. Dimitri was saying, what is the most interesting chord you have encountered in modern day pop music?
Wow. That's an interesting... So the thing is, man, that's a really interesting question that I have a hard time answering, because so much of what's going to make a single chord interesting then has to do with how it's voiced, how it's orchestrated, and so forth. The things that interest me the most are the ones that I can't identify right away. But once I work out, that's what's going on with that, I can make some sense out of it. So like one of the things, since I have the Beatles on my mind, the opening chord to Hard Day's Night is like one of those ones like, what was that? And then they have to sit down and realize that it's some big stack of things and figure out how it relates to what else is going on. That's one of those chords that had that effect on me. I had no idea what that chord was, and I loved it for that reason.
Yeah. And I think I just wanted to say, I think we're in a cool time where we're seeing more and more like jazz trained musicians in pop.
Yes.
And so stuff is getting really cool in modern music.
Yeah, and there's a number of people that I would always point to as the people who typically would push the envelope. Stevie Wonder is another one who really writes some interesting chords. And also, it's not a given that because you're blind you don't read music. I mean, Ray Charles read music fabulously. Right. He had all the traditional Braille training, but I'm told that Stevie Wonder didn't. And so but yeah, he definitely writes interesting chord progressions that I have to listen to several times to figure out, now what was that chord. And yeah, it is coming from some of a jazz kind of perspective. Steely Dan also, all sorts of chords in their music that are interesting and like, oh man, I'm not really sure where that chord is coming from or how to make it happen. For that matter, though, I was always really fascinated growing up by this one song in a John Denver song. I think it was Calypso. Was it Calypso? I think, where one of the chords you don't need it's just all the open strings on the guitar.
Oh, interesting.
That's the chord.
Huh.
And it, in the context of that piece, made perfect sense. And I think it's Calypso because I don't think it's Eagle and the Hawk, but it's something from around that era.
Love it. Well, and I love how you started this. I just want to bring back to that like a chord kind of isn't just interesting on its own.
Yeah, it's about context. Sometimes the chord, like Hard Day's Night chord, that's interesting on its own. That chord was interesting on its own, but typically that chord was interesting on its own, but we've heard this chord a million times. Every time someone picked a guitar and strummed it, it was never interesting until someone put it in the context of a song and made it interesting. Right.
Love that. Top Fingers was asking something, maybe you understand a little more, but I would love to hear more teasers from your hour on the minor 2 chord.
Yeah, so what I'll tell you about that is it's not about the chord, it's about the journey. But to a very, very large extent, a whole lot of so I use the term jazz standard. Some people would just call them standards. Some people would call it the Great American Songbook. We're talking about the music of people like George Gershwin or Cole Porter, people who are not jazz musicians per se, but they wrote the popular music of the 30s and 40s, the Broadway shows, the movie themes, the pop songs that jazz musicians love to improvise on still to this day. And Paul McCartney was quite familiar with a lot of that music as well. That body of music is a huge part of the jazz vocabulary, and a huge amount of it we could essentially say is journeys from 1 to 2 and back again. In other words, we have our 1 chord, and then we do some fancy stuff, and now we're on a 2 chord. And then we do some fancy stuff, and then we're back on a 1 chord. Now that doesn't sound at all like jazz, but if I say, oh, I'm on a 1 chord, and then I'm gonna go 1, 4, 3, 6, as a way of getting to 2, or I could go 1, 2, 3, sharp 2 diminished 2, which is if I fell, or I could go 1, or I can go da, 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 da. There's all sorts of different ways I know to get from 1 to 2, and every one of those I learned from a particular song that does it. And I was like, oh, that song uses that way of getting from 1 to 2. I wonder if I could use it in this other song to get from 1 to 2. This way of looking at things is a big part of what the Harmony and Chord Progressions course kind of builds up to. I call that progression that leads from 1 to 2 a pre-cadence, because the return journey from 2 to 1 is called a cadence. That's what everyone calls it. But no one has a term for the journey to 2. I had to make up a term for it, and I called it a pre-cadence. So it's about knowing a dozen different ways of getting from 1 to 2, and then a dozen different ways of getting from 2 back to 1, and then also a dozen different ways of just spinning your wheels and coming back to 1. There's all these different ways of just kind of spinning around and coming from 1, going around the block and coming back to 1. So journeys from 1 to 2, and then from 2 back to 1, at some level makes up like 80% or more of the harmonic vocabulary of these standards.
Love it. Yes. That's so fun. So is that an hour you regularly do, or is this the
music masterclass?
Yes.
The hour on the 2 chord was just some random thing. I said I could spend a whole hour on the 2 chord, but I know. It is the case though that language of talking about pre-cadences and the different ways of getting from 1 to 2, that is a whole lesson or two in my harmony and chord progressions course, where I show you, hey, these are the different ways of getting from 1 to 2, and here's how they all work in terms of use of secondary dominants and borrowed chords and whatever tritone substitutions, which is a technique I didn't have time to talk about today, but is in that course also. So I tell you all the tools that you can use to get from 1 to 2, but then there's a whole lesson where I just collect them all and say, hey, let's use those to get from 1 to 2, because that's an important thing to need to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have to slowly wrap up for time here.
Yeah.
But I wanted to sneak in 2 questions, and I'm going to try and make them short. One is, when you're just starting like to really wrap your head around these different chord progressions, what do you think is the best way to get your head around what's possible? Is it to go out and learn new ones? Is it to sit and just play stuff? Like, just to broaden the vocabulary, how do you open up your toolbox?
Yeah. So the off the cuff answer is take my course. That's how you do it. But
Right.
other than
Love it,
that,
though. Yeah.
other than that, I will say the single most valuable thing that I've ever done was a version of what you saw me do in this workshop. You saw me play a whole bunch of songs back to back in the same key. And that way I was able to see, hey, look, that minor 4 chord showed up in all those same places. And I knew it was a minor 4 chord because it was literally that same F minor chord. I didn't have to do the math to say it was minor 4. Playing songs back to back in the same key is the thing that taught me more than anything else has ever taught me about anything. I learned more about harmony from doing that, because not only, in order to do that, well, first of all, I had to transpose the songs to get them there, and I didn't do it by writing them out first. I transposed them by ear, so I would have to learn the song well enough to play by ear and then transpose it, which basically means play by ear in another key. So I had to learn those skills to do it. And then once you play, like maybe I'd spend a week working on, say, 10 songs, and this was the 10 songs that I worked on that week. At the end of the week, I'd say, now I'm going to play all those 10 songs back to back in the same key. And then, you talk about I feel like I said this earlier, but light bulb moment. No, this was giant explosion, giant nuclear sun explosion going off of, oh my God, this song and this song that I never thought of as having anything in common. When you actually play them back to back in the same key, you see, hey, this section of this relates to this here. And the connections that are made are just astounding.
I love that. Yeah. God, I wish someone had told me that my first time playing.
I wish someone told me that long before I had to stumble on it.
I love it. And then one other thing I wanted to throw out, because I've been playing around with this a lot with students and just having fun, but can't you just kind of put a 5 chord in front of wherever you want to go?
A 5 chord, you mean like the actual 5 chord of the key, or the 5 chord of the thing you want to go?
The 5 chord of the thing you want to go.
Yes, that's what a secondary dominant is. I mean, it's that. I will say there are some places where it feels more in place than others. And as just a example of this, when I talk about music being 4-bar phrases or 2-bar phrases or 1-bar phrases, they also have kind of a strong and weak side. The beginning of the phrase is the strong side. The end of the phrase is the weak side, because that's leading into the next phrase. That's where your 5 chord goes. It's leading into the next phrase. And every once in a while, someone will build me, like this one guy I play with. He just, I know he did this on purpose. He deliberately put the 2 chord and the 5 chord crossways, like the wrong side of the phrase. And it made an 8-bar phrase feel like a 9-bar or a 7-bar. It just really messed me up to have the 2 chord at the end of the 4 bars and then the 5 chord at the start of the next 4 bars. It just made it made it feel like I was a measure missing from that phrase. And he did it on purpose just to mess with me, because we were writing songs. We had a regular weekly gig, and we were both writing songs every week, and that was a lot of fun. But yeah, so there's certain places where it feels natural, and it's all about creating that expected tension.
Right. Love it. Well, Marc, we have to wrap up for time, but I appreciate it so much, especially just the way you're able to boil down these things into actionable, like useful things right in the moment is so helpful, because I know it's easy to get caught in music theory and then not know what to do with it in the moment.
It definitely is, and having a roadmap is good.
Yeah. So love it. Thank you so much for your time.
And
I
thank
did.
you for hosting.
Oh, it's been a blast. Love this. And for everyone watching, thank you for being here. Please pop into the comments. Thank Marc for his time and his expertise. Take a look at that course page. It's in the description. And also, I am dropping in the comments as well. Marc gave us a link for some resources today. So if you wanted any additional resources, they're there for you to grab. And before we wrap up, Marc, did you have any last bits of advice for building chord progressions? Any tasty chords or little things you just want to drop in a second before we head out?
Yes, yeah. Actually, the last thing that I want to do is just a plug specifically for that music masterclass. I do this stream every Thursday on my community. So if you have the link to my community, or if you go to the school, you can click community at the top. You end up on my on the community site, and you'll see where the music masterclass is, and that's where I do every Thursday morning. Well, morning for me, whatever time it is for you. A live stream session where I look at other people's music and I critique it. I say, hey, here are the things they're doing great. So we all are learning from each other. Here's some things maybe you could do differently. And I'll do little lectures of my own in there too. And it's an amazing resource, and people really get together and give each other feedback there in the community. Fantastic thing. So this whole month we're going to be doing harmony as kind of our theme, because
Cool.
so I'm hoping that everyone who's here signs up for the course, and then participates in the masterclass and starts posting the music you've been creating so we can be talking about it.
Love it. Love it. Thank you so much once again. And for everyone watching, if you had a good time, please like and subscribe to the Spotlight channel, where we're bringing folks like Marc out here to help us hone our skills and business and so many things, so much more. It's been an absolute pleasure this last hour with you. We'll see you soon.
Thank you so much, Jonah.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. See you everyone later.